Welcome back to Practical Stoicism. Today, we're going to do something we have never done. Over the last few months, the number of emails that I have received from listeners has grown astronomically. And in those emails are a few recurring questions, all asked in different ways. So I thought I would spend this week's midweek episode answering these things in a sort of Ask Me Anything or AMA style. I'm doing this for two reasons. The first is that it's very possible some of these questions, due to their frequency anyway, I would think so, are questions that you've had in the past and just haven't written in to ask me. So maybe you'll benefit by hearing them and my answers to them. Secondly is because I want to send the message to everyone listening that a big part of what I care about doing with this podcast is helping people work through things without feeling like they have to abandon their Stoic practice or feeling that Stoicism just can't help with certain things. So before I start, I would like to invite you to always feel welcome to send me questions. And you can do that by using the contact form at stoicismpod.com. And then also a blanket disclaimer before we start. I am not a licensed therapist or psychiatrist. And of course you know that. I've never led you to believe otherwise, but I'm saying that so that you understand, especially ahead of me giving advice, that any advice I give comes from a genuine desire to help, my personal Stoic practice and philosophy, and my personal view of the world. I do not think that anyone, no matter who they are, should take the opinion of just one person, no matter who they are, and run with it, as if that's the only input they need. I am not a life coach, I am not a guru, and I don't want you to think that I am trying to present myself as any one of these things. I'm just a Stoic who wants to provide what advice he can when he's asked for it. So with that, let's get into our first question. Dear Tanner, I have been interested in Stoicism both as a philosophy and as a religion, for lack of a better term. And while I don't yet consider myself a Prakopton, I have been listening to both your podcast and the Stoicism on Fire podcast, and have been trying to live more in line with Stoic principles. I have been a daily user of cannabis for some time, and it has occurred to me that this habit might not be in line with Stoic philosophy, given that I don't use cannabis for medical reasons. I also use nicotine products on a daily basis, which I suppose would sort of fall into the same category. I'm curious what your thoughts might be on these kinds of things. Should a Prakopton aim to avoid vices such as these? Starting things out pretty heavy here, Tanner's personal take on marijuana. Hopefully you don't all rain one-star reviews down upon me. But it would seem to me that the use of anything as medication is likely in line with a Stoic way of life. If someone is using marijuana under the guidance of a medical professional, there is absolutely no issue with that. Marijuana can reduce inflammation, help manage pain, and help fight anxiety. So, as far as I'm concerned, personally, the use of marijuana, again, under the guidance of a medical professional, is above board, or that is to say, is totally legit as far as any Stoic would be concerned, I think. Now, that said, getting high is different than using CBD to treat chronic pain or any other condition such as anxiety. When we get high, or drunk, or when we trip on shrooms, as an example, the idea is very frequently that we are trying to escape reality. That's why we're doing those things. We get drunk to cope, we get high to cope, we take mushrooms to cope, although some people will tell you it's to expand our minds. Now, I'm no square, as my father would have said, I guess, in the 60s. I don't think that having a night out with friends and doing any of those things I just mentioned makes you a bad person, or isn't even sometimes exactly what someone might need to let off a little steam or work through an issue. I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a doctor. I'm not a therapist, right? I feel like I need to remind you of these things, but I don't think that those things are always bad. However, mind-altering drugs like alcohol, marijuana, and mushrooms do something that the Stoics would have likely frowned upon. They allow you to escape reality. And when I say frowned upon, I mean habitual use. The Eleusinian mysteries, for example, are something that Marcus Aurelius participated in. And it's thought by many that part of those mysteries, that rite of passage, I guess maybe we could call it, or those rituals, would include the drinking of psychedelic liquid that would, essentially it would be as if you were tripping on shrooms. So we're not necessarily talking about one-off use here, we're talking about habitual use. And as far as habitual use is concerned, the Stoics would have thought that that was bad because you would be using that to habitually escape reality. Now, of course, films also help you escape reality. So do books, so do many other things. But what would you think of someone who refused to interact with the outside world and only watched movies all day? Maybe they would think they were happy doing that, but do you think they'd really be? Maybe you'd think they were a little bit like Mike TV from Willy Wonka's Chocolate Factory. You know, the kid whose entire life revolved around television? Or someone who used food to soothe their anxiety like Augustus Gloop, also from Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory. Or someone who was addicted to gum, like Violet Beauregard, or the Veruca Salt girl who wanted to have every physical possession she could because she coveted possessions above all else. Maybe you're beginning to see that there might have been more to that Willy Wonka movie than you thought there was. People use all sorts of things to distract themselves from the world. And when they do this, it is called escapism. Any activity that is used as a crutch and that prevents you from engaging with the world or your problems in a straightforward way so that you might not just treat them but actually resolve them is a thing that the Stoics would have probably frowned upon. The ancient Stoics would have probably frowned upon. And I would even wager that modern Stoics, like myself, would frown upon it as well. There's nothing wrong with smoking weed from time to time, but requiring it because you can't face the day without it suggests a deep problem that needs to be addressed. So again, irregular use, that's not anything anyone else hasn't done, to include the ancient Stoics, right? But perpetual, reliant, habit-forming use, and not all habit is physical addiction. It can be psychological addiction. It can be you, again, becoming reliant. That's not what the Stoics would have thought was the way to go. Question number 2. Hey, Tanner. I was just wondering what your personal thoughts were on the theory that we are living in a simulation. Also, how do you think Marcus or any other prominent figure in Stoicism would have reacted if they thought that our reality was not reality? I'm going to go ahead and say that thinking we live in a simulation is a bit too big of a Pascal's wager for me to spend too much time seriously ruminating on. That is to say, if I decided to risk believing that we were in a simulation and that nothing mattered as a result, and I wound up being wrong, that would mean I had spent a lifetime being useless. The only lifetime I would ever get. So, simulation or otherwise, there's no practical application for thinking about this. Not from my perspective anyway, but for the record, no, I don't think we're living in a simulation. And the ancient Stoics, had they had the modern sensibilities necessary to wonder such a thing, they would have likely framed it as existence being a simulation of the gods as a way of helping humans to develop virtue. And so I don't think it would have changed their views too drastically. Question number 3. Hi, Tanner. What do you believe is the strongest way to overcome needless anxiety and overthinking during the day? Thoughts such as, I wonder what X will be like in 500 years, or will this task I'm doing even matter in the far future? Staying in the present is difficult for some. What do you think is a good way to process these thoughts? Thanks. So I would say first to the asker of this question that they should read Thomas Nagel's paper on the absurd. I will link it in the show notes. It is an incredibly good read and perhaps the most useful read of my teenage years, or maybe my early 20s. The most dense and useful part of it is at the very beginning where Nagel gives us a real brain fryer of an opening. Here it is. Most people feel on occasion that life is absurd, and some feel it vividly and continually. Yet the reasons usually offered in defense of this conviction are patently inadequate. These people could not really explain why life is absurd. Why then do they provide a natural expression for the sense that it is? Consider some examples. It is often remarked that nothing we do now will matter in a million years. But if that is true, then by the same token, nothing that will be the case in a million years matters now. In particular, it does not matter now that in a million years nothing we do now will matter. Moreover, even if what we did now were going to matter in a million years, how could that keep our present concerns from being absurd? If their mattering now is not enough to accomplish that, how would it help if they mattered 1,000,000 years from now? Whether what we do now will matter in 1,000,000 years could make the crucial difference only if mattering in 1,000,000 years depended on its mattering, period. But then to deny whatever happens now will matter in 1,000,000 years is to beg the question against its mattering, period. For in that sense, one cannot know what will matter in 1,000,000 years, whether, for example, someone now is happy or miserable, without knowing that it does not matter, period. Like I said, real brain fryer, it took me probably a full year to process Nagel's point here, but it's a powerful one, and I would encourage you to read the rest of the paper, which is only, by the way, 12 pages or so long. So again, that is linked in the show notes. As far as how to prevent your mind from wandering in the first place, no doubt reminding yourself of Nagel's writing will always bring you back to focus, if you can remember to remember it. But I frequently recommend music for those who are easily distracted while working. That may sound counterproductive. You might be thinking, wouldn't music be distracting? But I have found more often than not, it keeps the distractions out and your focus in. I would also suggest that you talk to someone about your focus issues if you have them, because if you have an attention deficit condition of some kind, getting treatment for it will change your life. This isn't me saying if you have attention issues that you have ADHD. I'm only saying that frequent overthinking and an inability to focus is a symptom of ADHD, and that might be worth looking into. Okay, so here, let's take a break, and when you return, I will answer a couple more questions, and then we'll wrap up. Welcome back, and a quick reminder, if you hate ads and you want to get rid of them, please go to stoicism.supercast.com and sign up for the premium version of this show, which features no ads, no preambles, and gets straight to the point. Next question is, hey Tanner, I'm passionate about certain things, ideas, or subjects, and I can get emotional, especially if someone angers me. How can I use Stoicism to help control my emotions better? I think the first step is to realize that none of your initial emotional responses to stimuli or input or someone being a jerk to you are unstoic. Stoics have emotions, and the difficulty of wrangling with emotions is part of why there are no sages in Stoicism. No Stoic has ever been or ever will be perfect. That includes me, it includes you, it includes everyone who's listening, and it includes every Stoic that ever lived. And it's helpful to keep this in mind the next time your emotions get the better of you. You can say to yourself, this isn't because I'm a bad Stoic or a bad person, it is because controlling emotions is hard. And even the most renowned Stoics struggled and continue to struggle with it. The second step, I think, is to reflect on the utility of anger, or any emotion really, even positive ones, which we will be talking about in an upcoming Saturday episode. How often does anger help versus how often does it hurt? I personally don't believe that the actions arrived at through anger have ever been the best versions of a person's actions, nor that they have ever yielded the best versions of a solution. But that doesn't mean that anger doesn't sometimes get things done. Certainly it can. But I believe anger more often damages relationships, harms your credibility, and ultimately does a worse job at finding a solution than cool level-headedness does. You might disagree with that. And goodness knows we are definitely living in an age of furious activists everywhere. But an activist gets angry and holds signs and throws rocks through shop windows on occasions, or maybe sets things on fire. They aren't the ones getting things done. Lawyers are getting things done. Volunteers and advocates are getting things done. And those people aren't shouting at the top of their lungs in the streets, insisting that what they're doing is the thing that's going to get the answers. They're too busy working on the answers to participate in that stuff. Now, to be fair, you could be both of those things, but a dozen motivated, passionate, and competent volunteers are far more valuable than 1,000 screaming, angry, shouting activists. That's because advocacy and volunteering is work. Protesting is not. So the next time you're angry about something that you're passionate about, play out in your head how anger is going to lead to a resolution. You'll likely find that it isn't. Then ask yourself what you can do, physically do, to make at least a small impact and do that, because a small impact is better than no impact, and standing in the street and shouting has no impact because it's not really work. It's just expression of anger. And that might make you feel better, and it might help other people feel like you're on their side, but it's not ultimately doing anything near as much as you being a volunteer somewhere. Protesting about lack of good food in public schools doesn't really accomplish anything. But building a program to help fund better school lunches, that's a lot harder. It's a lot more work. Not everyone can do it, but it's got a lot more impact. Anger might motivate you towards those things, and in that way, perhaps anger is useful, but it's always good, diligent, consistent work that brings about change. So try to focus on that. The last question of this episode is going to be the one I get most frequently. The asking of it here is just one of the ways it's formed, but I have probably received more than 36 of these questions, of this specific question, just this month. It's about relationships. Tanner, I've been struggling with heartbreak. How do you think I can use Stoicism to cope with heartbreak? This is actually a lot easier than it sounds. When someone breaks up with you, there's a reason. It might not be a reason you like, but that other person wasn't happy. If the person you love isn't happy, only two things can be true in your response to that. Number one, you love them enough to understand that their leaving would make them happier, and therefore the best thing that could have happened for them. Or number two, you prioritize your own happiness over the happiness of the person who left, which means you didn't love them the way any person deserves to be loved in a relationship. And the breakup was beneficial both because it made them happier and it stopped you from continuing to mistreat another human being. But what if, as some have asked, what if that person cheated on you and you left them because of that? Again, it comes down to having a rational view of what's going on. If someone has cheated on you, it is a clear indication that either they are dissatisfied with you and the relationship, in which case the end of that sort of relationship is a net good for everyone involved, because you don't want someone to pretend to be happy with you, and they shouldn't be with someone who they aren't happy with. If they weren't happy with you, and if they didn't respect the monogamous nature of the relationship that you trusted to them, that means, in addition to them being unhappy, they are also untrustworthy. So then the worst case scenario is that an unhappy, untrustworthy person has left you or you've left them. Now, how can that be something worth lamenting or being sad about? But as others have pointed out in their emails to me, what if it's not about the breakups so much as the aftermath? What if it's more about just feeling lonely? What if the problem is that I'm lonely and I hate being alone and I'm sad because I'm alone? How can Stoicism help me deal with that? This is easier to understand, I think, than it is to accept and act on. But essentially, if being alone makes you sad, there's very likely something you do not like about yourself. And I want to flesh that thought out a little bit because I don't want to sound dismissive in saying that. Maybe an analogy will make this easier. Have you ever been on a road trip with someone who can just talk for hours without you replying or even paying attention? It seems like it's impossible for them to shut up. They require no response from you. They'll just go on and on. The reason those people are like that is because they either lack self-awareness and are completely self-absorbed, or they are afraid of silence. And it is usually the latter. When there is no one around, no one to talk to, and no noise to distract you from you, you have to think. And when people who are unhappy with themselves think too much, they inevitably come across all the things they don't like about themselves, and then they dwell on those things and obsess over them. And that is terrifying, frankly. It's very upsetting. It is far easier to talk or to distract yourself with a romantic relationship than it is to confront the things about being alone that make you feel bad. A person who is affected negatively by being alone, by not being in a relationship, has something deep down, or maybe right at the surface, that relationships, noise, and distractions prevent them from addressing and improving. And for almost all of us, that thing is feeling worthy. and people usually assign struggles of self-worth with problems that mostly women deal with. But I think, at least in my personal experience, I think just as many men struggle with this, with feeling like they belong, like they're part of something, like they're worth something. Suicide rates among men are very high. I think they are far higher than suicide rates among women. And I'll let you in on a little secret here. One of the reasons that I started this podcast was because I knew that most of my listeners would be men, and I also knew that most of my listeners, maybe that's you, will be met with a lot of advice out there about being a man that doesn't really do anything to help men with concerns over their worth. In fact, that kind of advice, and I won't name names, is more likely to exacerbate those problems, those feelings of inadequacy or lack of worthiness. Most people who struggle to be alone struggle because they require external validation of their worth. They can't tell themselves they're worthy. Someone else has to tell them that they're worthy. Now, that can come from a romantic relationship, a friendship, a family, or a group of like-minded people that you've never met before, but you play video games with them every night. But these things keep you from working on and answering the question, what makes me worth something? The answer to that question is never my friends or my bank account or my significant other. Those relationships do not dictate your worth. And even if they did, what a fickle and dangerous way to determine one's worth. For you would be forever in a position of needing to keep those people happy, lest you lose your worth. And that's what a great many of us do, actually. So if being alone makes you sad, it's an indication that you need to spend more time alone. In fact, I was just remarking to my significant other just the other day on the front porch. We were having a beer at 5 o'clock or something, watching the traffic go by. I said that for some reason this came up in conversation. She was struggling with something, and I said anything that is hard to do, that is to say anything that intimidates you, is something that one should seek to do. Because if it's hard to do, if it's hard to bring yourself to do it, that must mean you have a hang-up of some kind concerning it. Maybe it's a fear, maybe it's self-doubt, but whatever it is, if you're afraid to approach it, that's probably an indication that you need to approach it. There's this quote, it's from Joseph Campbell, no relation. Although I'm a huge fan of his work, I wish there was a relation. And it says, "The cave you fear to enter holds the treasure you seek." And the idea behind that is that anything which is hard to do, by doing it, you overcome the fear of doing it and gain something really valuable, confidence, feelings of self-worth, etc., etc. So if you're afraid to do something, you should always set out to do it because there's a built-in inherent value of doing it, even though you're afraid to, rather, especially because you're afraid to. So for any of you struggling with being alone, you need to double down on being alone. And you need to ask yourself some really deep questions on why being alone is so difficult for you. What part of having company have you become addicted to and why? And how can you manage and then overcome that addiction? And this is a really important one to me because there are some pitfalls that surround this. There are some really bad ideas of how to approach this. The incel community gets a lot of crap, right? But the incel community is the incel community mostly because when they get to this problem, they don't have anybody talking to them, like I am talking to you now, who can suggest some other way to reflect on and solve this problem that isn't misogynistic. And so they become incels because someone convinces them that that is the correct way to deal with this problem. It is not. The correct way to deal with this problem is to identify what makes you feel unworthy without external validation. It is not to look at those sources of potential external validation and hate them or view them as the problem. That is perhaps the worst psychology that anyone could present to a young, impressionable, in this case, male mind. Now, of course, enjoying a friendship is a joyous thing, right? We should have friends, but requiring a friend in order to feel worthy is a form of self-enslavement. How can you be a good friend if you cannot let the friendship go when it is time? You cannot be addicted to a friendship because what lengths might you go to keep a friend who wants to leave? Would you lie? Would you deceive? Is that healthy? And the same is true of a romantic relationship. They are a joy to take pleasure in. But they become toxic when they are things you cannot live without, when you view them as your lifeblood or your key to feeling useful, meaningful, valuable, worthy. You must have a healthy relationship with your relationships, or else it is better to forego them entirely until you are able to enjoy them responsibly. Now, as is the case with most advice from the Stoic perspective, or at least from mine, the secret doesn't necessarily lie in the advice. It lies in the revelation you have after hearing the advice. But revelation isn't a stand-in for implementation. You can academically understand the points that I've made in these last minutes that you've been listening, but academically understanding them is not useful unless you implement them. All Stoicism can do is help you to identify what is wrong, and perhaps it can inspire you to work towards a solution, but ultimately, the thing that helps you overcome the problem is perpetual exposure to the logic of the revelation. You have to do the work of normalizing this logic into your understanding of the world around you. Or, perhaps better put, practice, practice, practice. Thank you so much for listening today. I know this was a little bit of a different style. I hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to submit questions for next month's Ask Me Anything, please check for the link in the show notes and go do so. You could do that right now if you want. I hope you enjoyed this format. I hope you're still enjoying this podcast. If you haven't reviewed the show yet, you can do that on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or podchaser.com. Links in the show notes to do all those things. And if you're enjoying it, let me know. I hope you have a great rest of your week. Thank you again for being here and listening. And until next time, take care.